On the afternoon of March 5, 1931, a frail woman who had not been seen by the outside world for 24 years opened a hotel room door and screamed for help. Inside room 552 of the Herald Square Hotel, investigators discovered $1 million in cash stuffed into shoeboxes and sewn into dress pockets, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry hidden in tins, and a 93-year-old recluse who claimed to be a Southern belle from Louisiana's plantation aristocracy. Within months, her own family would have her declared insane, drug her unconscious to search her belongings, move her to a new room against her will, and place armed guards outside her door. She would spend her final months screaming from her window that she was being held captive. When she died, 113 people would fight over her fortune in one of the most spectacular inheritance battles in American legal history. And all the while, no one knew who she really was. This is the story of Ida Mayfield Wood, except that it wasn't her name. The backstory of Southern Belle was fictional. Her daughter was actually her sister. Her aristocratic lineage never existed. But her fortune was real. And so was the dark struggle for power that consumed her final years, revealing how easily Gilded Age families could strip a woman of her freedom, her dignity, and her fortune. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you enjoy learning about the fascinating stories behind the world's most remarkable estates, consider subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, united by our shared curiosity about these architectural treasures and the people who inhabited them. What Happened to Ida Wood reveals a side of Gilded Age America that few discuss. The legal mechanisms that allowed families to imprison women in their own homes, declare them incompetent without evidence, and wage wars over inheritances while the woman at the center lost every freedom she possessed. Chapter 1. The door opens. The hotel manager in Herald Square had worked there for 7 years and had never seen the occupant of room 552. He knew two things about the fifth-floor suite. Rent was always paid in cash, delivered promptly, and the elderly woman inside did not want to be disturbed. The hotel staff had learned not to ask questions. On March 5, 1931, that changed forever. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the door to 552 opened. A small, elderly woman stood in the doorway. She had not opened the door voluntarily in 2 decades, her voice weak but urgent, carried down the hallway. She rang the doorbell. The hotel manager arrived within minutes. What he saw when he entered room 552 shocked him and silenced him. The living room was filled from floor to ceiling with trash. Yellowed newspapers from the 1890s were stacked in towers that reached the ceiling. Balls of used string filled the corners. Wooden trunks lined every wall. Empty biscuit tins covered every surface. The smell was overwhelming. Years of rotting food, unwashed bodies, Vaseline and cigar smoke created a miasma that made breathing difficult. On the sofa, covered in a stained sheet, lay the body of a woman who appeared to be in her early 90s. She had been dead for some time. The elderly woman who had called for help stood amidst the chaos, remarkably composed, despite the horror that surrounded her. She was wearing a tattered nightgown and worn slippers. Her long white hair hung loosely down her back. Despite her unfortunate appearance and surroundings, her face had an unexpected beauty. Her skin was smooth, almost translucent, with a pink glow that seemed impossible for a woman her age. Later, investigators would discover her secret. Vaseline applied daily for hours. Hundreds of empty jars testified to decades of lonely vanity. The hotel doctor from the nearby Hotel McAlpin arrived and confirmed what everyone already knew. The woman on the couch was beyond help. The manager, overwhelmed by the situation, contacted the law firm of O'Brien, Boardman, Conboy, Memhard and Early. 2 lawyers, Morgan O'Brien Jr. and an associate, arrived within the hour. O'Brien began asking questions. The woman claimed her name was Ida Mayfield Wood. The deceased, she said, was her sister, Mary Mayfield. She explained that she had another sister, Emma Wood, but Emma had died in a hospital 3 years earlier, in 1928. The 3 women had lived together in this suite since 1907. They hadn't left those rooms in all that time. The hotel staff confirmed the timeline. According to their records, 3 women had checked into room 552 in 1907 and had essentially disappeared. A maid reported that in 24 years she had only been allowed to change the sheets twice through a crack in the door. A bellboy explained his daily routine. He knocked once a day and asked if the ladies needed anything. They always ordered the same items: condensed milk, biscuits, coffee, bacon, eggs, occasionally fish. Sometimes they asked for Copenhagen snuff, Havana cigars, and jars of Vaseline. Ida always tipped 10 cents, claiming it was the last money she had in the world.
Heiress Imprisoned.
Who was Ida Wood? Where did she come from? How had she come to live like this? Ida, suddenly talkative after years of silence, began to tell her story. She claimed to have been a famous bell ringer in the South. She came from the wealthy Mayfield family of Louisiana, plantation owners of sensation. She had moved to New York in her youth and had married Benjamin Wood, newspaper publisher, former congressman, brother of Fernando Wood, who had been mayor of New York City. O'Brien was skeptical but intrigued. He called his elderly father, who had practiced law in New York in the 1880s. The elder O'Brien confirmed parts of the story. Yes, he had known Ida Wood. She had been a prominent socialite known for her beauty and, interestingly, her business acumen. Benjamin Wood had indeed been a wealthy and politically connected figure. If Ida was telling the truth about her identity, she was not poor despite her surroundings. But O'Brien noticed something else when Ida spoke. She was sharp, eloquent, and clearly in control of her abilities. She might have lived in squalor, but she was not insane. Then Ida mentioned, almost casually, that she had money stashed in the suite. A lot of money. O'Brien looked around the dingy room. If there was money here, finding it would be like looking for diamonds in a landfill. But as a lawyer, he knew he had a professional responsibility. The next day, with Ida's permission, he began the search. What they discovered was beyond anyone's wildest imagination. In a shoebox was $247,000 in cash. In the pockets of one of Ida's dresses, sewn into the lining, were 50 $10,000 bills. $500,000 bills were hidden in her clothes. The bills had been printed by the U.S. Treasury more than 50 years earlier and were no longer in circulation, but they remained legal tender. The search widened. They found Union Pacific Railroad stock certificates worth tens of thousands of dollars. Bonds with unearned coupons dating back decades. In the hotel basement, Ida had stored 54 suitcases. Inside these suitcases lay treasures that seemed impossible. Bolts of the finest lace from Ireland, Venice, and Spain. Dresses from Paris worth thousands of dollars each. Diamond necklaces, ruby bracelets, emerald tiaras, gold certificates from the 1860s, a gilded ebony cane, a Wood family heirloom that had been a gift from President James Monroe to Fernando Wood, an 1867 letter from Charles Dickens to Benjamin Wood. In an old knockoff box, they found a diamond necklace valued at $40,000. The original appraisal estimated Ida's fortune at over $1 million, more than $30 million in modern currency. The poor recluse was one of the wealthiest women in New York.
O'Brien facade dilemma.
News of this discovery would spread. The hotel staff were already talking, and Ada, for all her mental clarity, was living in conditions that posed serious health risks. She needed protection. The question was from what? From whom? The answer revealed itself soon enough, and it would transform Ida's last years into a nightmare of forced guardianship, family betrayal, and a battle over her fortune that would rob her of all freedom. Chapter 2.
Ellen Walsh's Gambit.
The woman the world knew as Ida Mayfield Wood was born Ellen Walsh in Old Lancaster, England, on January 14, 1838. Her parents, and Crawford and Thomas Walsh, were Irish immigrants who had fled poverty in Ireland, only to find another kind of poverty in England's industrial cities. Thomas worked as a shopkeeper and laborer, struggling to feed their growing family. Ellen was one of 11 children born into circumstances that offered no prospects beyond survival. When Ellen was about 6 or 7 years old, the Walsh family immigrated to the United States. They settled in Malden, Massachusetts, a working-class town outside Boston. Thomas found odd jobs. The family lived in conditions that would later be described as you quote time. Ellen grew up watching her mother age rapidly under the weight of poverty and childbearing. And Crawford Walsh had been born in the slums of Dublin and had known only hardship all her life. She had no education, no social advantages, and no tools to help her children rise above their status. Her wisdom was limited to survival. Work hard. Keep your head down. Don't attract attention. Ellen rejected this completely. From an early age, Ellen exhibited qualities that set her apart from her siblings. She was observant. She watched how wealthy people behaved as they walked through town. She studied their clothes, their speech, their mannerisms. She read newspapers, stolen or borrowed, that covered the happenings of high society in Boston and New York. She developed a keen sense that poverty was not inevitable. It was a circumstance that smart people could escape. She was also beautiful. As a teenager, Ellen possessed the kind of delicate dark-haired beauty that transcended class. Her features were delicate. Her figure was slender and graceful. Her eyes were large and expressive. If she could dress properly, speak properly, and behave properly, she could pass for one of the race. But passing required more than looks. It required a backstory, and that backstory had to be bulletproof. Ellen began her transformation around the age of 18 or 19. She began calling herself Ida Ellen Walsh. The name Ida sounded more refined, more southern, more unlike an Irish immigrant name. She practiced speaking without her working-class Boston accent, imitating the soft drawl she had heard from southern visitors to Massachusetts. She studied the social media of newspapers covering New Orleans and Louisiana, learning the names of prominent families, plantation locations, and details that would make her fictional story believable. Then she moved on. She changed her last name from Walsh to Mayfield. The sound was everything. The Walsh sense of Irish poverty. Mayfield suggested pastoral English estates. It sounded like old money. She convinced her sister Mary to change her name too. Mary lacked Ellen's ambitions but followed her example. Another sister, younger, would eventually become Emma Wood. The backstory Ellen created was meticulous. Her father, she would claim, was Henry Mayfield, a wealthy sugar plantation owner in Louisiana. Her mother was Anne Mary Crawford, a descendant of the Earls of Crawford, a Scottish noble who had established herself in the American South. She was born on the Mayfield plantation, educated by private tutors, and raised in luxury. Circumstances, deliberately vague, had brought her north to New York. The details remained fluid, changing slightly depending on the audience, but the gist remained consistent. She was a Southern aristocracy, raised to sophistication and deserving of the life she intended to claim. In 1857, at the age of 19, Ellen Walsh, now calling herself Ida E. Mayfield, left Massachusetts for New York City. She traveled alone, which for a young unmarried woman in the 1850s was scandalous if she actually came from the background she claimed. But Ellen understood that arriving alone, mysteriously without family connections, could serve her. She would be exotic, exciting, and impossible to verify. New York in 1857 was a city that was changing itself. The wealth generated by shipping, manufacturing, and railroads created a new aristocracy. Men who had started with nothing built fortunes that rivaled those of the European nobility. These men needed wives, or at least companions who could give them social legitimacy. Ellen arrived in the city with almost no money. She found lodgings in a boarding house, the cheapest and most respectable option. She had no connections, no introductions, no legitimate way into society. Everything she had read about how high society worked suggested that her situation was hopeless. Entry required family connections and wealth. She had neither. What she did have was a boldness that would define her entire life. Ellen began to study the society pages of New York newspapers with intense attention. She learned who was important, who was newly rich, who was married, who was widowed, who had mistresses. She identified men who had money and power but lacked social glamour. Men who might appreciate a beautiful, seemingly well-behaved young woman who could offer companionship without demanding immediate marriage. One name repeatedly appeared in the newspapers: Benjamin Wood. Benjamin Wood was 37 years old in 1857. He was part owner and editor of the New York Daily News, a Democratic newspaper with a significant circulation. He had political ambitions. He would later serve in Congress and the New York State Senate. His brother, Fernando Wood, had already served as mayor of New York City and was to serve again. The Wood family was politically connected, wealthy, and powerful. Benjamin was also married to his second wife, Delia, and had a reputation as a man who enjoyed female company beyond his marriage. Ellen saw possibilities, but she faced a fundamental problem. She had no way of meeting Benjamin Wood. She could not attend the events he often attended. She had no mutual acquaintances who could introduce her. The social barriers between a poor immigrant girl and a newspaper publisher were absolute unless she broke all rules of decency and contacted her directly. On May 28, 1857, Ellen Walsh, who called herself Ida E. Mayfield, wrote a letter that would change her life. The letter was extraordinarily bold. It would Mr. Sir, having heard of you often, I venture to address you after hearing a young lady, one of your former mistresses, speak of you. She says you are fond of new faces. I imagine that since I am new in town and affairs are progressing, I can enter into a pleasant intimate relationship with you as long as you see fit. I do not think I am extremely ugly or unpleasant. Perhaps not quite as beautiful as the lady with you just now, but I know a little more. And there is an old saying, knowledge is power. If you want an address for an interview, then a letter to the number Broadway, P.O. Box, New York, stating when we can meet. The letter violated every norm of respectable female behavior in 1857. Young unmarried women did not propose to married men. They did not offer themselves as mistresses. They did not write suggestive letters about affairs of the heart to strangers. If Ellen's letter became public knowledge, her fabricated reputation would be ruined before it was established. But Ellen had calculated the risk. Benjamin would not show the letter to anyone. If he was interested, he would respond discreetly. If he was not interested, he would burn the letter and forget about it. There was no disadvantage except potential embarrassment, and Ellen had no reputation to lose anyway. Benjamin replied. He agreed to meet. At their first meeting, Benjamin later reported to me. He found a quote 7 that was quoted as number 8. Ellen, who called herself Ida, was charming, eloquent, and presented herself as the daughter of Louisiana plantation owners. She claimed that her mother was descended from Scottish nobility. She said she had come north for reasons she preferred not to discuss, hinting at a family tragedy while avoiding verifiable details. Benjamin, whether he believed her story or simply didn't care, was captivated. Within weeks, Ida Mayfield became his mistress. The transformation was complete. Ellen Walsh, the daughter of Irish immigrants from the slums of Massachusetts, had become Ida Mayfield, Southern belle and companion to one of New York's most prominent men. Everything that followed, the fortune, the social standing, the decades of power, flowed from that moment. But the foundation was a lie, and lies, even successful ones, require constant maintenance. Ida would spend the next 40 years defending her invented identity, never allowing anyone close enough to question her story. When she finally locked herself in room 552 in 1907, she wasn't just hiding from financial panic. She hid from the world, which might discover who she really was. Chapter 3. The Mistress Years. As Benjamin Wood's mistress in 1857, New York was not a shameful secret to keep. For Ida, it was a position of power that opened doors that no amount of inherited wealth could have provided. Benjamin was married, but his marriage to Delia was apparently more one of convenience than passion. New York society, especially among the wealthy and politically connected, operated with an understood hypocrisy. Men of good means kept mistresses, and as long as discretion was maintained, scandal was avoided. Ida understood the rules perfectly. She was visible enough to establish herself in society, but discreet enough to avoid becoming the target of gossip. She attended events on Benjamin's arm when Delia was absent or unwell. She was introduced to the political and business elite as a young woman of good Southern family. No one investigated her claims, because no one was particularly interested. The Gilded Age valued money and connections over pedigree. Through Benjamin, Ida gained access to a world she had only read about in newspapers. In 1860, when the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward III, visited New York City, Ida was among the young women introduced to him at social events. She danced with the prince at a ball, an honor reserved for the most prominent women in the city. The newspapers reported on the event, noting her grace and beauty. Ida Mayfield Wood, the Southern belle, had arrived. Less than a year later, in early 1861, Ida was introduced to the newly elected President Abraham Lincoln as he passed through New York on his way to Washington for his inauguration. The meeting was brief, a reception at which dozens of New York's elite were introduced to Lincoln. But Ida remembered it for the rest of her life. She had met the future martyr president. It was confirmation that her invented identity had gained acceptance at the highest level. Newspapers began mentioning her regularly in social media columns. Quote 9. About promoting the fiction she had created. Quota 10. A society writer was thrilled. Ida cultivated this image carefully. She dressed in expensive clothes, even though Benjamin paid for them. She wore jewelry that she later sold and replaced. She learned to ride in a carriage with the precise posture and demeanor expected of refined women. But Ida didn't just play a role. She also watched, learned, and planned. She observed how the truly wealthy women managed their affairs. She noticed who had authority in marriages, who protected assets, who made strategic decisions. She understood that beauty and social position were temporary. The only permanent security was financial power. Benjamin Wood's weakness became apparent early in their relationship. He was a gambling addict. He gambled on everything: cards, horse races, political elections, business ventures. He had the income to sustain his gambling habit, but his losses were significant and frequent. Ida watched him lose thousands of dollars on a single night. She watched him struggle to pay the bills after bad spells. She realized that unless she intervened, Benjamin's gambling would eventually destroy his fortune and her security. Ida proposed a deal that demonstrated her business acumen and her influence over Benjamin. She would not interfere with his gambling or complain about his losses. In return, when he won, he would share the winnings equally with her when he lost. The losses were his alone to absorb. It was a brilliant deal. Ida would get half of any winnings without any of the downside risks. Benjamin agreed, apparently impressed by her logic and unwilling to lose her to gambling. Over the years, this deal turned over huge sums of money to Ida's management. She saved every dollar of her share of Benjamin's winnings. She invested conservatively. She never gambled herself. When Benjamin's losses became particularly severe, Ida went a step further. She convinced him to transfer property into her name as a form of protection. If creditors came after Benjamin, they could not touch property that Ida owned. The arrangement made legal sense, but it also gave Ida ownership of assets that nominally belonged to Benjamin. Slowly and methodically, she acquired his fortune while he focused on gambling and politics. In 1861, Benjamin Wood was elected to the United States Congress as a representative from New York. He served 2 terms from 1861 to 1865 during the Civil War. His newspaper, the New York Daily News, supported the Democratic Party and sympathized with the Confederacy, what was called a Copperhead publication. Benjamin's political views were controversial, but his position in Congress improved his social status and thus Ida's. Delia Wood died in 1867. Ida had been Benjamin's mistress for 10 years. With Delia's death, the obstacle to marriage disappeared. Benjamin, now 57, married Ida, who was 29. The wedding was not particularly elaborate. Neither wanted to draw attention to the fact that Ida had been his mistress for a decade, but the marriage fully legitimized her position as Mrs. Benjamin Woods. Ida's social status became unassailable. She was no longer a mistress, but the wife of a former congressman, current newspaper publisher, and brother of a former mayor. Society columns treated her with respect. Invitations poured in from the most prominent families. She had achieved everything she had set out to achieve when she wrote that bold letter 10 years earlier. The couple presented a picture of domestic contentment. They had a quote 12 Emma Wood. Although Emma had been born before their marriage, society politely overlooked this detail. Benjamin adored Emma and treated her as his legitimate child. No one questioned the timeline too much. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, Ida and Benjamin participated in a ritual that became their hallmark. Ida's carriage would arrive at the Manhattan Club, where Benjamin spent his days doing business and gambling. 2 footmen in livery would accompany her. Benjamin would immediately get out and join her in the carriage. Together they would ride up Fifth Avenue, Ida sitting stiffly upright. Her parasol tilted against the sun as she observed and was observed. It was a public display of their partnership and status. Ida's management of Benjamin's fortune became increasingly aggressive. When Benjamin bought the New York Daily News outright in the 1870s, Ida became involved in the business. She convinced Benjamin to give her a controlling interest in the newspaper. She claimed it was to protect the estate. In reality, it gave her ownership of his most valuable asset. Over time, Benjamin's net worth declined while Ida's rose. By the 1880s, most of Benjamin's property was nominally owned by Ida. His bank accounts were largely empty. When he needed money, he asked Ida for money, and she provided it in exchange for further transfers of assets. It wasn't exactly theft. Ida protected them both from Benjamin's self-destructive gambling. But it was also a systematic transfer of wealth from husband to wife that left Benjamin financially dependent on the woman he had once supported. Society saw none of this. They saw a devoted couple married for decades. Benjamin, prominent in social and political circles, again served in Congress from 1881 to 1883. His brother, Fernando Wood, remained influential until his death in 1881. The Wood family was established, respected, and wealthy, or so it seemed. Behind the facade, Ida was preparing for the inevitable. Benjamin was getting older. His health was deteriorating. His gambling was getting worse. When he died, she needed to have absolute control of the estate. She could not allow his children from previous marriages to claim inheritance. She could not allow creditors to seize assets. Everything had to be secured in her name, protected, indisputable. When Benjamin Wood died on February 21, 1900, Ida had achieved her goal. The New York Times obituary noted, quote, 13. This was technically true. Everything was in Ida's name. She had transformed herself from a poor Irish immigrant to the wealthy widow of a former congressman. She owned assets worth about $2 million, the equivalent of over $60 million today. The newspaper, the property, the investments, it all belonged to her. At age 62, Ida Mayfield Wood was one of the wealthiest women in New York. And no one knew that Ida Mayfield Wood did not exist. Chapter 4. The Widow's Lineage. Benjamin Wood's death in 1900 should have been a moment of vulnerability for Ida. Widows in Gilded Age America, even wealthy ones, often faced challenges from stepchildren, creditors, and male relatives who questioned a woman's ability to manage property. But Ida had prepared too thoroughly. When Benjamin died, she owned everything, and the legal documentation was impeccable. The funeral was attended by New York's political and business elite. Ida, dressed in mourning black, played the role of the grieving widow with conviction. She received condolences from congressmen, judges, and newspaper publishers. No one questioned her right to inherit. The transfers had been legal, documented, and completed years earlier. But within weeks of the funeral, Ida made decisions that revealed her true priorities. She had no interest in preserving Benjamin's legacy. She wanted liquidity and security. Her first major decision concerned the New York Daily News. Ida had a controlling interest in the paper but no desire to run it. She understood the publishing business as little as most women of her time. Benjamin had hired managers and editors, but his personal commitment had been crucial to the paper's success. Without him, the paper faced an uncertain future. Ida appointed Benjamin's nephew, also named Benjamin Wood, as business manager. This was a strategic choice. Having a member of the Wood family to run the operation provided continuity and reduced the risk of employee revolt. But Ida's heart was not in the newspaper business. Within months, her management style created problems. Editors resigned. Employees were fired. Her nephew tried to maintain stability, but Ida's interference made it difficult. In 1901, Ida sold the New York Daily News. The exact sale price remains disputed. Sources report between $250,000 and $340,000. Regardless of the exact amount, Ida sold for several times what Benjamin had paid for the paper. She turned the newspaper, a business that required constant attention, into cash she could manage. Absolutely. The sale shocked Benjamin's acquaintances. The New York Daily News had been his pride, his political platform, his legacy. Ida sold it within a year of his death, but Ida was not sentimental. The newspaper was an asset that needed to be liquidated. She then began systematically selling other possessions. Benjamin had collected art, furniture, sculptures, and tapestries. Ida auctioned them off. She sold paintings by respected artists. She sold furniture that had filled their home. She sold virtually everything except items she deemed either essential or too difficult to liquidate profitably. The sales generated several $100,000 extra. Ida deposited everything in accounts with the Guarantee Trust Company, one of New York's most prestigious banks. By 1902, she had about $1 million in liquid assets, cash and securities that could be quickly converted into cash.
Dette repræsenterede størstedelen af Benjamins formue, som nu var helt under hendes myndighed. Med sin økonomi sikret kunne Ida have trukket sig tilbage til et komfortabelt enkestand.
Hun var 64 år gammel i 1902.
Hun kunne have levet godt af renterne fra $1 million, underholdt beskedent, rejst og måske engageret sig i filantropi. Mange enker i hendes klasse fulgte præcis denne vej. Men Ida begyndte at ændre sig på måder, der foruroligede dem, der kendte hende. Hun begyndte at bruge mindre tid i sociale sammenhænge.
Hun afslog invitationer. Hun stoppede med at være vært for arrangementer.
Venner, der ringede, fandt hende i stigende grad uvillig til at modtage besøgende. Hendes mistanke, som altid havde eksisteret, intensivredes. Hun blev besat af sine penges sikkerhed.
Hun besagt regelmæssigt Guarantee Trust Company for at verificere sin kontosaldi.
Hun afhørte bankansatte om sikkerhedsprocedurer. Hun krævede detaljer om, hvordan banken investerede indskud.
Bankmedarbejderne, der var vant til at håndtere ekscentriske, velhavende klienter, fik hende til at behage hende, men fandt i hemmelighed hendes opførsel bekymrende. Idas angst strakte sig til hendes boligforhold. Hun flyttede fra det hjem, hun havde delt med Benjamin, til en række mindre boliger.
She kept minimal staff, the fewer servants, the fewer people who might steal from her or learn her secrets. She trusted almost no one. The only people Ida maintained contact with were her sisters, Mary and Emma. Mary had also changed her name to Mayfield and had lived in New York for decades, supporting Ida's invented backstory. Emma, the supposed daughter, was actually the youngest Walsh sister. The three women, all unmarried except for Ida's widowhood, drew together into an increasingly isolated unit. By 1905, Ida's social isolation was nearly complete. She no longer attended events. She saw no friends. She communicated with bank officials only when necessary. She lived quietly, spending almost nothing, allowing her wealth to compound through conservative investments. Then came 1907 and everything changed. In October 1907, the New York Stock Exchange lost approximately 50% of its value in a matter of weeks. The panic of 1907, triggered by failed speculation, bank failures, and a liquidity crisis devastated American financial markets. Banks that had seemed impregnable faced runs as depositors demanded their money. Without federal deposit insurance, which would not exist for another quarter century, depositors who lost confidence in their bank could lose everything. The Guaranteed Trust Company was a strong institution. But in the chaos of the panic, no bank seemed entirely safe. Depositors lined up outside banks demanding cash. Some banks collapsed, their vaults emptied by panicked withdrawals. Newspapers reported failures daily. Wealthy people who had considered their fortunes secure watched them evaporate. Ida, anxious under the best circumstances, became convinced the Guaranteed Trust Company would fail. She imagined scenarios where her $1 million, the entire fortune she had spent 40 years accumulating, would vanish. She saw herself reduced to poverty, back to the life of Ellen Walsh, everything lost. In November 1907, Ida arrived at the Guaranteed Trust Company and demanded the entire balance of her accounts in cash. The bank officers tried to reassure her. The bank was sound, her money was safe, but Ida was beyond reassurance. She wanted cash bills she could hold, count, and manage. The bank complied. Over the course of several visits, Ida withdrew her entire fortune. The final withdrawal brought her liquid cash holdings to approximately $1 million. She stuffed the bills into trunks and satchels. She hired a carriage to transport the money. She took it to a location she had already selected, the Herald Square Hotel. Ida, Mary, and Emma checked into room 552 in late November or early December 1907. They brought their trunks, their cash, and their securities. They took a 2-room suite on the 5th floor. They paid the first year's rent in advance in cash, and then they closed the door for 24 years. Chapter 5. The Fortress. The Herald Square Hotel stood at 19 West 31st Street in the heart of Manhattan's theater and shopping district. Herald Square itself, the intersection of Broadway 6th Avenue and 34th Street, was one of the busiest commercial centers in New York. The hotel was respectable, but not luxurious, catering to long-term residents and visitors who wanted proximity to the action without paying Fifth Avenue prices. Ida had chosen room 552 deliberately. It was high enough to discourage casual visitors, 5 flights of stairs in an era when many buildings lacked elevators. The suite consisted of 2 rooms, a parlor and a bedroom with a small bathroom that Ida converted into a makeshift kitchen. The windows overlooked the bustle of Herald Square, though Ida draped them with heavy curtains that blocked almost all natural light. Inside the suite, the 3 women created a strange domestic arrangement. They slept in the bedroom, all three sharing the space. They spent their days in the parlor. They smoked cigars. Ida developed a taste for Havana cigars and smoked them throughout the day. They read old newspapers, though they never bought current ones. Mary kept stacks of yellowed newspapers from the 1880s and 90s, organizing them by date, preserving them as one might preserve family photographs. They kept the world out through systems of fear that became more elaborate over time. They refused maid service completely. The room was never cleaned, never aired out. Garbage accumulated because they would not allow anyone to remove it. Food waste, empty boxes, used string that Mary collected and wound into balls. All of it stayed, transforming the suite into a slowly composting monument to isolation. The few times hotel staff attempted to enter, Ida resisted with surprising force. Once a new manager, concerned about the conditions, attempted to insist on at least removing trash. Ida threatened to leave the hotel immediately, though everyone knew she would never follow through. The hotel backed down. The rent was always paid in cash on time. A paying tenant who caused no trouble beyond refusing service was in the hotel's view an ideal tenant. The anxiety extended to mail and communications. The hotel delivered no mail to room 552 because none ever arrived. Ida had severed all contact with the outside world. Friends from her society days, if any, remained alive by the 1920s. Had no way to reach her. Family members, at least those who might have known where she was, apparently never tried to contact her or chose not to intrude. The cash itself presented logistical challenges. Ida had withdrawn $1 million from the Guarantee Trust Company in 1907. That money in bills of various denominations had to be hidden throughout the suite. She developed an elaborate system. Small bills went into shoe boxes. Medium denominations were stuffed into pots and pans. The $50 $10,000 bills, an enormous sum representing half her liquid wealth, were sewn into a pouch that Ida wore tied around her waist, under her dress, against her skin. She never removed it. When she bathed, which became increasingly rare, the pouch stayed with her. The stock certificates and bonds posed different problems. These had to be preserved, but kept hidden. Ida stored them in trunks wrapped in cloth, protected from moisture. Many of these certificates had uncashed interest coupons attached. Ida never cashed them. To do so would require leaving the suite, interacting with banks, exposing herself to the world. Better to leave the money unclaimed than risk the fortress walls. Food preparation in the bathroom was a daily ritual that demonstrated Ida's resourcefulness. The hot plate was small, old, and dangerous. It frequently short-circuited, filling the room with acrid smoke, but it allowed them to cook bacon and eggs without leaving the suite. Fish, which they ate raw, required no cooking. The evaporated milk mixed with water provided calcium. Crackers offered carbohydrates. Coffee provided stimulation. It was a diet designed for survival, not pleasure. Why did they live this way? What had driven 3 women to voluntarily imprison themselves? The answer lay in events from 1907. The panic, the bank runs, the fear that gripped wealthy Americans who watched fortunes evaporate overnight. But there was more to it than financial panic. There was deep suspicion certainly, but there was also power. Ida had spent her entire adult life managing her circumstances. She had reinvented herself from poverty to privilege. She had directed her husband's gambling fortune. She had converted all of his assets to her name. She had sold his newspaper for hundreds of thousands. Every major decision of her life had been about authority, managing her narrative, commanding her wealth, directing her fate. In room 552, she maintained total dominion. No one could touch her money. No one could challenge her story. No one could take what was hers. The price of that power was freedom, human contact, and eventually her sanity. But Ida had made her choice decades earlier. She would live and die on her own terms, locked away from a world that might question who she really was. Chapter 6. The Years of Decay. What began as temporary protection in 1907 gradually transformed into something far darker. The first year in room 552, Ida likely told herself she would return to society when the financial crisis passed. The second year, she made the same promise. By the 5th year, the lie was harder to maintain. By the 10th year, it was impossible. The psychological toll of this existence manifested differently in each sister. Mary, who had always been the follower, adapted to the routine. She seemed content with her string collection and her newspapers. She rarely spoke, according to the few hotel employees who heard her voice through the cracked door. She simply existed, a shadow in the background of Ida's increasingly isolated world. Emma suffered more visibly. In accounts from hotel staff who occasionally glimpsed her through the door, Emma appeared sad, withdrawn, staring out the window at the Herald Square she could no longer visit. But she never left. Whatever held the three sisters together, loyalty, fear, complicity in Ida's fiction, was stronger than Emma's apparent longing for the outside world. The physical deterioration of the suite accelerated as the years passed. Garbage accumulated in mountains. Food waste rotted in corners. The smell became overpowering. The stench of decay. Unwashed bodies and cigar smoke creating an atmosphere nearly unbearable. Hotel staff who occasionally got close to the door when delivering food reported that the odor alone was enough to make them gag. The sisters' personal hygiene deteriorated in parallel with their environment. Bathing became increasingly rare. By the 1920s, Ida reportedly bathed once every few months at most. Mary and Emma followed suit. They wore the same clothing for weeks. Their hair went unwashed. The only exception to this neglect was Ida's face. She continued massaging petroleum jelly into her skin for hours each day, maintaining the complexion that had once been her greatest asset. The trunks stored in the basement became a security obsession for Ida. She had arranged for hotel staff to store 54 trunks in the basement storage area, paying extra for the space. These trunks contained the bulk of her material wealth, jewelry, fine fabrics, gold certificates, family heirlooms. But Ida could not access them without leaving the room, which she refused to do. Instead, she lived with the anxious certainty that the trunks were being rifled through, her treasures stolen, her wealth depleted. Several times over the years, Ida sent written notes to hotel management demanding that specific trunks be brought to her room. Hotel staff would haul the heavy trunks up 5 flights of stairs, knock on the door, and leave them in the hallway. Hours later, Ida would crack the door, pull the trunk inside, and examine its contents. If everything was present, which it always was, the hotel being honest, she would eventually push the trunk back into the hallway to be returned to storage. In 1928, Emma's health deteriorated to the point where even Ida recognized she needed hospitalization. The exact circumstances of how this was arranged remain murky, but Emma was taken to a hospital, probably by ambulance, possibly with Ida claiming Emma was a tenant who had fallen ill, but providing no other details. Emma died in the hospital at age 71 alone without Ida or Mary visiting her. The hospital recorded her death, but apparently did not pursue much information about her family. She was buried, her death certificate filed, and the world moved on. For Ida and Mary, Emma's death meant one fewer person in the cramped suite. The room became slightly less crowded. The food orders were reduced proportionally. Life continued with almost no acknowledgement that a third person had been present for decades and was now gone. By 1930, Ida was 92 years old and Mary was 91. They had spent 23 years locked in room 552. Neither had been outside in more than 2 decades. Neither had spoken to anyone except each other and the bellhop through a cracked door. They were living mummies guarding a fortune they would never spend. The New York City that bustled below their window had changed enormously since 1907. The Herald Square they had known, already busy then, had become a frenzied commercial center. Cars replaced carriages. Electric signs lit up the night. The subway rumbled beneath the streets. Women wore shorter skirts and bobbed hair. The Gilded Age had given way to the Jazz Age, which had crashed into the Great Depression. Ida knew nothing of these changes. Her world had frozen in 1907. She lived in the past, surrounded by newspapers that reported events from the 1890s, wearing clothes from the turn of the century, existing in a bubble where the bell poke never ended, and Ellen Walsh was still Ida Mayfield. Then on March 5, 1931, Mary fell ill. She collapsed on the couch in the parlor, unable to move or speak. Ida faced a crisis she could not handle alone. She could ignore her own suffering. She had ignored Emma's death from afar, but Mary was dying in front of her in the room, and Ida could not pretend it was not happening. For the first time in 24 years, Ida opened the door and called for help. The fortress walls came down in an instant, and waiting outside were forces that would destroy the last year of her life more thoroughly than all the decades of self-imposed isolation. Chapter 7. The Nephew Appears. The discovery of Ida's wealth in room 552 created a sensation that spread through New York despite attorney Morgan O'Brien's attempts at discretion. The hotel staff talked. The nurses hired to care for Ida talked. Word reached the newspapers. And word reached people who had long assumed Ida Mayfield Wood was either dead or penniless. Among those who learned about Ida's fortune was a man named Otis F. Wood. He was the son of Fernando Wood, Benjamin Wood's brother, the former mayor of New York. This made Otis technically Ida's nephew by marriage, though their relationship was distant and had not been maintained. Otis was in his 60s. He had last seen Ida when he was a young boy, more than 60 years earlier. He had assumed, like everyone else, that she had died decades ago. When Otis learned that his aunt was not only alive but wealthy, he contacted attorney Edward Corcoran and expressed his desire to quote Ida. His concern appeared benevolent on the surface, an elderly relative discovered living in squalor, clearly unable to care for herself. In possession of a fortune that made her vulnerable to theft and exploitation, what nephew would not want to step in and provide assistance? But Otis did not arrive alone. He brought his 3 brothers, all sons of Fernando Wood, and several of their children. They hired their own attorneys, and very quickly their quote 15 took the form of a petition to the courts to have Ida declared incompetent and placed under guardianship. Ida, meanwhile, had been moved from room 552 to a room on the 4th floor. The hotel manager, overwhelmed by the filth and the media attention, insisted she could not continue living in the squalor of her original suite. Ida protested. Quote 16, she insisted, but the hotel moved her regardless. The new room was cleaner, brighter, and in Ida's view, a prison. She had not wanted to leave 552. That room had been her fortress, her safe space, the center of her carefully managed world. The new room felt exposed, vulnerable. She was right to feel that way. Attorney O'Brien attempted to protect her interests. He sent Harold Wentworth, another attorney in his firm, to visit Ida daily. Harold brought fresh roses, tried to build rapport, and gently suggested that Ida should deposit her cash in a bank where it would be safe and earn interest. Ida refused every suggestion. She did not trust banks. She wanted her money where she could see it. O'Brien also hired 2 private detectives to rent the room next door and maintain 24-hour surveillance. He was concerned about theft. With news of Ida's fortune spreading, criminals might target her. But he was also concerned about the Wood family members who were circling with increasing aggression. Within weeks of Mary's death, the legal maneuvering began. Otis Wood and his brothers filed a petition in New York surrogate court arguing that Ida Mayfield Wood was incompetent to manage her own affairs. They presented evidence she had lived in filth for decades. She hoarded cash instead of investing it properly. She refused medical care. She was elderly and clearly suffering from some form of mental illness that made her unable to make rational decisions. The petition did not mention that declaring Ida incompetent would allow the Wood family to gain authority over her estate. It did not mention that if Ida died without a will, which she had not made, her fortune would potentially be divided among her heirs, which could include the Wood family descendants. The petition was framed entirely as concern for Ida's welfare. O'Brien opposed the petition, arguing that Ida was eccentric, but not incompetent. She was capable of managing her affairs and had done so successfully for decades. Her decision to live in seclusion was unusual, but not evidence of insanity. The cash hoarding was a rational response to the panic of 1907, not a symptom of incompetence. But O'Brien faced a difficult challenge. The general public reading newspaper accounts of the quote 17 discovered in filth found it easy to believe she was insane. The fact that she had hidden in a hotel for 24 years seemed like clear evidence of mental illness. The petroleum jelly obsession, the hoarded string, the refusal to bathe, all of it supported the narrative that Ida was not competent. In September 1931, the court heard testimony. Medical experts appointed by the Wood family examined and reported that while she was physically frail, she appeared mentally sharp. She could recall events from decades earlier with clarity. She could perform arithmetic. She knew who she was, where she was, and what year it was. But the doctors also noted behaviors they considered evidence of incompetence. She refused to bathe. She insisted on hoarding cash. She refused medical treatment. She showed signs of suspicion, particularly regarding her money. She believed people were trying to rob her, which the doctors interpreted as delusional, even though given the circumstances, it was probably accurate. The court's decision came down on September 22, 1931. The jury found Ida Mayfield Wood to be incompetent. Specifically, they used the term lunatic, which was standard legal language of the era, but harsh nonetheless. The court appointed Edward Corcoran as special guardian over Ida's person and estate. Corcoran was an attorney with experience in guardianship cases. He was not part of the Wood family and theoretically represented a neutral party who would protect Ida's interests. But Corcoran worked closely with Otis Wood and his family. The practical effect of the guardianship was that the Wood family now had legal authority over Ida and her fortune. Ida's reaction to being declared incompetent was telling. When informed of the court's decision, she told a reporter, "I did quite well, you know, and it seems strange they should call me incompetent. I made money and I kept it. So many people whom everyone considers competent can't do that." She was right, of course. By any objective measure, Ida had managed her finances brilliantly. She had turned Benjamin Wood's gambling fortune into her own secure wealth. She had sold his newspaper at a profit. She had protected her assets through the panic of 1907. Her fortune remained intact despite decades of economic upheaval that had destroyed many fortunes. But competence in Gilded Age America was not measured solely by financial success. Women, particularly elderly women, who defied social norms, were vulnerable to guardianship proceedings that stripped them of autonomy. Ida's refusal to behave as society expected, her rejection of proper living conditions, her hoarding, her isolation made her an easy target. The guardianship gave Corcoran, and by extension the Wood family, extraordinary powers. They could access Ida's bank accounts. They could search her possessions. They could make medical decisions for her. They could move her against her will. They could direct every aspect of her life. And they intended to use every one of those powers. Chapter 8. Drugged and Violated. What happened next represents one of the darkest aspects of Gilded Age guardianship law. Once Ida was declared incompetent, she effectively became the property of her guardian. Her protest carried no legal weight. Her wishes were irrelevant. She was, in the eyes of the law, a lunatic who could not be trusted to make decisions about her own life. Corcoran and the Wood family faced an immediate problem. Ida refused to cooperate. She would not reveal where all her money was hidden. She would not allow them to search her possessions thoroughly. She kept the pouch containing the $10,000 bills tied around her waist, under her dress, and refused to remove it. She hid cash in locations throughout the room that she would not disclose. The guardians needed to know exactly what assets existed. They needed to inventory everything for probate purposes and to establish the estate's value. Ida's refusal to cooperate was from their perspective an obstacle to proper estate management. From Ida's perspective, these people were trying to steal her money. She had spent 70 years protecting her wealth. She had endured 24 years of isolation to keep her fortune safe. Now declared insane by people who wanted her money. She was supposed to simply hand it over. She refused. The solution Corcoran and Otis Wood devised was brutal. But under the guardianship laws of 1931, entirely legal, they decided to sedate Ida and search her room while she was unconscious. On a day in late September 1931, the exact date is not recorded. Nurses hired by the guardians brought Ida her daily meal. The food contained a sedative, likely a strong dose of sleeping medication. Ida, who had survived for decades by being cautious and careful, apparently did not notice anything wrong with the food. Or perhaps living in a room that was essentially a prison, being watched constantly, she no longer had the energy to resist. She ate the drugged food. Within an hour, she was unconscious. While Ida slept, Otis Wood, Edward Corcoran, and several assistants entered her room and conducted a thorough search. They went through every box, every trunk, every corner. They found cash hidden in pots and pans. They found bonds stuffed between newspapers. They found stock certificates wrapped in old clothing. And they found the pouch tied around Ida's waist. One of the searchers, accounts differ on whether it was a nurse or one of the attorneys, used scissors or a knife to cut the pouch from Ida's body while she slept. They removed it, counted the $50,000 bills inside, $500,000, and took the money. When Ida woke hours later, the pouch was gone. The money she had guarded for decades, kept against her skin, protected with her life, had been taken while she was unconscious and helpless. Ida's reaction is not fully recorded, but according to nurses present in the aftermath, She wept. She screamed. She accused them of robbery. She demanded they return her money. She called them thieves. And worse, the guardians explained that they had not stolen her money. They had secured it. The cash was now in safe deposit boxes at the Harriman National Bank, where it would be protected and eventually distributed according to law. Ida did not accept this explanation. To her, the money had been stolen. She had been drugged and robbed by her own supposed guardians. The complete inventory of Ida's wealth confirmed what O'Brien had discovered months earlier, with additional cash found in various hiding places throughout the room. The total estate was valued at approximately $1.2 million, over $36 million in current value. Ida the Or 20 was wealthier than most of New York's social elite. But Ida no longer managed any of it. The guardianship had transferred complete authority to Corcoran and the courts. Every dollar of her fortune was now administered by others. The guardians made additional decisions that stripped away more of Ida's autonomy. They hired nurses to attend her 24 hours a day. Ida hated this. The nurses monitored everything she did. They reported her conversations, her complaints, her habits. She had no privacy, no freedom, no power. Otis would also hire guards to patrol the hallway outside her room. Officially, this was for Ida's protection. With news of her wealth public, they claimed she needed security. But the guards also prevented Ida from leaving. Not that she could leave easily, but the presence of guards made clear that she was a prisoner. Ida began screaming from her window. Nurses reported that on multiple occasions when they stepped out of the room or turned their backs, Ida would shuffle to the window, push it open as far as her strength allowed, and scream to the people below. "Help! Help! I'm a prisoner! Get me out of here!" The street noise of Herald Square was loud enough that most people did not hear her. Those who did likely assumed she was a disturbed old woman, not a wealthy eyes being held against her will. The nurses would pull her away from the window, close it, and scold her for disturbing other guests. The medical care imposed on Ida was another source of conflict. The guardians brought in doctors who prescribed treatments Ida did not want. They insisted she bathe regularly, which she resisted. They attempted to improve her diet, but Ida refused foods she did not recognize. She wanted crackers, evaporated milk coffee, the same food she had eaten for decades. The doctors and nurses tried to introduce variety, but Ida saw this as another attempt to dominate her. When nurses brought her meals that cost more than $1, Ida refused to eat them. "It's too much. Take it back." "I won't eat it," she would say. She had lived frugally for so long that spending money on food felt like waste. The nurses paid by the estate to care for her found this both sad and frustrating. Here was a millionaire refusing to eat a decent meal because it cost too much. The expenses of the guardianship mounted rapidly. Court filings from late 1931 show that Ida's estate was being charged over $3,000 per month for her care. This included nurses' salaries, attorneys' fees for Corcoran and the Wood family lawyers, guard salaries, medical care and medications, and hotel room rent and incidentals. The irony was brutal. Ida had spent 24 years living on almost nothing to preserve her fortune. Now declared incompetent, her estate was being drained at $36,000 per year, more than she had spent in the entire 24 years in room 552. And the people charging these fees were the same people who would benefit if she died quickly. The Wood family members who had petitioned for guardianship would inherit portions of her estate when she died. Every dollar spent on her care was $1 less for them to inherit, but every month of guardianship meant their lawyers could charge more fees. Ida understood this perfectly. Despite being declared a lunatic, she grasped the financial incentives at play. She told anyone who would listen that the Woods were robbing her, that the guardianship was theft disguised as care, that she was being held prisoner by people who wanted her dead so they could take her money. She was not wrong. Chapter 9. The Final Months. The winter of 1931 into 1932 was the longest of Ida's life. She had endured poverty as a child, the risks of establishing a false identity as a young woman, 40 years of maintaining an elaborate fiction, and 24 years of self-imposed imprisonment. But nothing compared to the helplessness of her final months. The nurses assigned to care for her reported a woman who alternated between lucidity and confusion, rage, and resignation. Some days Ida spoke clearly about her past, recounting events from the 1860s and 70s with remarkable accuracy. She described dancing with the Prince of Wales, meeting Abraham Lincoln, managing Benjamin's newspaper fortune. Her memory of these events was sharp, detailed, and consistent. Other days, she seemed lost in time. She would ask for Benjamin, forgetting he had been dead for 30 years. She would ask for Mary, forgetting that Mary had died months earlier. She would demand to know when she could return to room 552, not understanding that she would never go back. The physical decline accelerated. The stress of the guardianship and the force-feeding of proper nutrition her body could not process took a toll. She lost more weight. Her skin, which she had maintained so carefully, began to deteriorate. Without her daily regimen of petroleum jelly application, her face aged visibly over weeks. She stopped fighting the nurses about bathing. This was perhaps the saddest indication of her decline. Ida had resisted bathing for years as an assertion of independence. When she stopped resisting, it suggested she no longer had the will to fight. The newspapers continued to cover her story with sensational headlines. Recluse 93. Hoarding millions defies treasure searchers had been the early coverage. Now the story shifted to speculation about her death and the inheritance battle to come. Reporters tried to interview her, but the guardians blocked access. A few managed to shout questions when entering or leaving the hotel. Ida rarely responded, but once she called back, "I made money and I kept it. That doesn't make me insane." Behind the scenes, the legal maneuvering for her estate was already underway. Otis Wood and his brothers had hired multiple law firms. Children from Benjamin Wood's previous marriages, some of whom Ida had never met, hired their own attorneys and filed preliminary claims to portions of the estate. People claiming to be Mayfield family members from Louisiana began contacting lawyers, asserting that if Ida was really Ida Mayfield, they were her blood relatives and entitled to inherit. The will became a crucial question. Ida had never made a formal will. She had spent decades protecting her wealth, but had never executed the one legal document that would direct its distribution after her death. This was either an oversight, unlikely for someone as careful as Ida, or a deliberate choice. Perhaps she believed she would live forever. Perhaps she could not bear to decide who, if anyone, deserved her money. Perhaps she intended to write a will, but kept delaying. Without a will, New York's intestacy laws would determine inheritance. And those laws created a nightmare of competing claims. If Ida was legally Ida Mayfield Wood, wife of Benjamin Wood, then her heirs were Benjamin's blood relatives. Benjamin's children from previous marriages and their descendants would inherit. The Wood family, Otis and his brothers and their children would also have claims as relatives of Benjamin. But if Ida was actually Ellen Walsh, as investigators were beginning to suspect, then the Mayfield claims were fraudulent. And the Wood family's claims through Benjamin's marriage to Ida Mayfield might also be compromised. The true heirs would be Walsh family descendants, if any could be found. The question of Ida's real identity became critical. Attorney Corcoran began investigating, hiring researchers to trace back through records. They started with what they knew. Ida claimed to be from Louisiana, daughter of Henry Mayfield. Researchers checked Louisiana records for a Henry Mayfield who owned a plantation and had a daughter named Ida born around 1838. They found nothing. No plantation owner named Henry Mayfield. No birth record for Ida Mayfield. No evidence that the Mayfield family Ida described had ever existed. The researchers expanded their search. They looked for and Mary Crawford, supposedly Ida's mother and descendant of the Earls of Crawford. Again, nothing. No records connected the Crawford noble family to Louisiana or to anyone named and Mary. As the investigation progressed, researchers began finding traces of someone else. Records in Massachusetts showed a Thomas Walsh, Irish immigrant, who had settled in Malden with his wife and Crawford Walsh. They had multiple children, including daughters with birth dates that roughly matched Mary and Emma's ages. And they had a daughter named Ellen, born around 1838. The pieces began fitting together. Ellen Walsh had changed her name to Ida Mayfield. Mary Walsh had changed her name to Mary Mayfield. Emma Walsh had become Emma Wood, the supposed daughter. The entire Mayfield identity was fabricated. But proving this required finding living Walsh descendants who could testify about family history. Researchers began searching for Walsh relatives in Massachusetts, Ireland, and anywhere Walsh family members might have settled. While this investigation proceeded, Ida continued to decline. By early 1932, she was bedridden. The nurses reported that she rarely spoke. She no longer protested her treatment. She had stopped asking about her money. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for death. The one mercy was that the guardians did not move her again. She remained in the fourth-floor room at the Herald Square Hotel. Through her window, if she had the strength to look, she could see Herald Square, the world she had locked herself away from for decades, still bustling, indifferent to the dying woman above. On March 12, 1932, Ida Mayfield would died of bronchial pneumonia. She was 94 years old. She had outlived both her sisters, her husband, and almost everyone who had known her as a young woman. She died surrounded by nurses who were paid to care for her, but who did not know her. She died in the custody of guardians who wanted her money. She died with her real name still uncertain. Her obituary in the New York Times ran on the front page.
Quote 26.
The headline read, "The article summarized her extraordinary life, the wealth, the seclusion, the discovery, the inheritance battle to come." It mentioned the million-dollar estate and the hundreds of claimants already filing petitions. What the obituary did not mention was that Ida Mayfield had never existed. That revelation would come later. Chapter 10, 113. Claimant's death unleashed a legal feeding frenzy that stunned even experienced probate attorneys. Within weeks, people claiming to be her relatives filed petitions with a New York surrogate court seeking portions of her estate. The claims came from across the country and even from overseas. Each claimant needed to provide some evidence of relationship to Ida, but the standards were loose and the potential reward was substantial. By August 1934, more than 2 years after Ida's death, the official count of claimants reached 113. It was one of the largest inheritance battles in American legal history. The claimants fell into several categories, each presenting different legal theories. The Wood family descendants included Otis Wood and his brothers, their children, and descendants of Benjamin Wood's previous marriages. They argued that as Benjamin's legal widow, Ida's estate should pass to Benjamin's heirs under intestacy law. Their claims were the strongest legally, but only if Ida was legally Ida Mayfield Wood, wife of Benjamin. The Mayfield family claimants numbered in the hundreds. People with the surname Mayfield, primarily from Louisiana and other southern states, filed claims arguing they were blood relatives of Ida Mayfield. These claims were entirely fraudulent since Ida Mayfield had never existed. But the claimants did not know this yet. They had seen newspaper stories about the wealthy Southern belle and assumed she was related to their own Mayfield families. As investigators uncovered evidence that Ida was actually Ellen Walsh, a different group of claimants emerged. People with the surname Walsh, primarily from Massachusetts, Ireland, and England began filing claims arguing they were related to Ellen Walsh. These claims were closer to the truth, but proving precise genealogical connection to Ellen Walsh's siblings and cousins required extensive documentation from the 1840s and 50s. Some claimants had no legitimate connection to any name associated with Ida, but filed claims anyway, hoping the chaos of 1,100 competing petitions might allow them to slip through. One man claimed to be Ida's long-lost son. A woman claimed to be a cousin who had been disinherited. These claims were easily dismissed, but they added to the confusion. The surrogate court assigned attorney Joseph A. Cox's counsel to the public administrator, charged with determining Ida's true identity and legitimate heirs. Cox faced a monumental task. He needed to determine whether Ida was actually Ida Mayfield or Ellen Walsh. Trace Ida's family tree back to her parents and siblings. Identify living descendants of Ida's legitimate relatives, eliminate fraudulent claims, and distribute the estate according to law. The process took years and required investigations spanning multiple states and countries. Cox started with what the earlier researchers had discovered, evidence that Ida was Ellen Walsh. He sent investigators to Massachusetts to search records in Malden, where the Walsh family had settled. They found Thomas Walsh's death certificate. He had died in San Francisco in 1864. They found Crawford Walsh's death record in Massachusetts. They found birth records for multiple Walsh children, including Ellen, born around 1838. The investigators then tracked down living Walsh descendants. They found cousins in Massachusetts, relatives in Ireland, and descendants who had migrated to England. They interviewed these people, collecting oral histories and documentation of the Walsh family tree. One crucial piece of evidence came from an elderly woman in Massachusetts who remembered the Walsh family from her childhood in the 1850s. She recalled Ellen Walsh, described as pretty but ambitious, who had left for New York as a young woman and never returned. She remembered Mary Walsh, who had also gone to New York. She remembered the family's poverty and Thomas Walsh's struggle to support 11 children. Her testimony, combined with documentary evidence, established that Ellen Walsh had existed, had sisters named Mary and Emma, and had disappeared to New York in the 1850s, exactly matching Ida's timeline. The investigators then had to prove that Ellen Walsh and Ida Mayfield Wood were the same person. This required connecting the dots through circumstantial evidence. Ida appeared in New York in 1857, claiming to be from Louisiana. Ellen Walsh left Massachusetts for New York around 1857. Ida had a sister named Mary Mayfield. Ellen had a sister named Mary Walsh, Ida's daughter. Emma was actually her sister. Ellen had a younger sister named Emma. Ida's supposed aristocratic background had no documentation. Ellen's actual background was Irish immigrant poverty. The ages matched, the timeline matched, the relationships matched. Cox compiled this evidence into a report for the surrogate court. In September 1937, more than 5 years after Ida's death, Judge James A. Foley heard testimony and reviewed the evidence. The proceedings were covered extensively by newspapers. Reporters filled the courtroom. Hundreds of claimants attended, many represented by attorneys. The Wood family attorneys argued that even if Ida's birth name was Ellen Walsh, she had legally married Benjamin Wood as Ida Mayfield Wood. Her legal identity at the time of marriage was Ida, and therefore her estate should pass to Benjamin's heirs. The fact that she had changed her name before marriage did not invalidate the marriage or the inheritance rights. The Walsh family attorneys countered that Ida's true identity was Ellen Walsh and therefore her true heirs were Walsh blood relatives, not the Wood family, who were related only through Benjamin's marriage to a woman using a false name. Judge Foley's ruling was decisive. The court found that Ida Mayfield Wood was born Ellen Walsh in Old England in 1838. She was the daughter of Thomas Walsh and Anne Crawford. She immigrated to Massachusetts as a child. She changed her name to Ida Mayfield in her late teens or early 20s. She married Benjamin Wood in 1867 under her assumed name. Her daughter, Emma, was actually her sister, Emma Walsh. Her sister, Mary Mayfield, was actually Mary Walsh. Because Ida died without a will and her true identity was Ellen Walsh, her estate should be distributed to her legitimate blood relatives, descendants of the Walsh family. The ruling eliminated all Mayfield claimants immediately. Their claims were based on relationship to a person who never existed. Hundreds of people who had spent years pursuing the case lost everything in an instant. The ruling also eliminated most Wood family claims. Otis Wood and his relatives argued desperately that they should inherit based on Benjamin's marriage, but the court disagreed. Ida's estate was her own, not Benjamin's, and would be distributed to her blood relatives. Only the Walsh claimants remained. But even here, the court had to determine which Walsh descendants were legitimate heirs under intestacy law. New York intestacy law prioritized close relatives. Ida had no children. Emma was her sister, not her daughter. She had no living siblings. Mary and Emma had prediscased her. Therefore, the estate would go to her first cousins once removed, the children of her parents' siblings. Cox identified 10 authenticated Walsh relatives who qualified as legitimate heirs. Most of these people had never heard of Ida Wood. Some had never heard of Ellen Walsh. They were distant relatives living ordinary lives who suddenly found themselves heirs to approximately $90,000 each, equivalent to roughly $1.5 million each in current dollars. The final distribution was ordered on March 17, 1939, 7 years after Ida's death. After legal fees, court costs, and guardianship expenses were deducted, approximately $900,000 remained. This was divided equally among the 10 authenticated heirs. The Wood family received nothing. The Mayfield claimants received nothing. The fraudsters received nothing. The attorneys' guardians and court officials received hundreds of thousands in fees for 7 years of work. And Ellen Walsh's distant cousins, people who would never have met her, who had no idea she existed, became wealthy because of a fortune built on lies, authority, and suspicion. Chapter 11. Legacy of Secrets. The revelation of Ida's true identity created a peculiar problem. What to put on her gravestone? She had lived as Ida Mayfield Wood for 75 years. She had died as Ida Mayfield Wood. But legally, her name was Ellen Walsh. The cemetery needed a name for the burial record. The estate needed a name for the death certificate. The compromise was bureaucratic and sad. Her death certificate listed her as 29 quote. Her burial was handled by the estate with minimal ceremony. She was interred in an unmarked grave, or at least a grave whose marker, if it existed, has since been lost to time. No family attended. No friends mourned her. The nurses who had cared for her in her final months did not come to the funeral. She was buried as she had lived her final decades, alone, anonymous, and reduced to nothing but her wealth. The press coverage of the final ruling was extensive. Newspapers that had followed the case for 7 years ran extensive articles explaining the Ellen Walsh revelation. Some coverage was sympathetic, portraying Ida as a woman who had reinvented herself to escape poverty and had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. Other coverage was harsh, calling her a fraud, a liar, and a mentally unstable hoarder who had wasted her life hiding from imaginary threats. Ellen Walsh had been born into circumstances that offered no prospects. She had used intelligence, beauty, and extraordinary audacity to transform herself into a society woman. She had protected herself financially with brilliant strategic planning. She had outlived everyone who might have exposed her secret. By any objective measure, she had succeeded spectacularly. But she had also paid a price that seems, in retrospect, far too high. She had spent 75 years maintaining a fiction that required constant vigilance. She could never be fully honest with anyone. She could never relax. She could never trust. The fear that allowed her to protect her secret eventually consumed her life entirely. The 24 years in room 552 were the logical endpoint of a life built on absolute authority over circumstances. If you trust no one, you end up alone. If you protect secrets obsessively, you end up isolated. If you value money above all else, you end up counting bills in a hotel room while life passes you by. The Walsh relatives who inherited her fortune largely disappeared from public record after receiving their inheritances during the Great Depression. $90,000 in 1939 was an extraordinary sum for people living through the Depression. It was life-changing. Most of the heirs apparently invested wisely and used the money to secure their families' futures. None achieved the wealth or notoriety that Ida had possessed. But then none of them spent 75 years living a lie. The Herald Square Hotel continued operating for decades after Ida's death. Room 552 was cleaned, renovated, and rented to new tenants who probably never knew its history. The hotel itself was eventually demolished in the 1960s as Herald Square continued its transformation into a commercial district. The site where Ida spent 24 years in self-imposed imprisonment is now occupied by modern buildings where tourists and shoppers pass without knowing the story of the woman who once hid there. The one aspect of Ida's legacy that endured in legal circles was the case itself. In Rhode Island estate of Idaho became cited in later legal proceedings involving identity fraud, intestate succession, and guardianship abuse. Law students read about the case as an example of how complex estate proceedings could become when the deceased's identity was uncertain. Joseph A. Cox, the attorney who had unraveled Ida's identity, published a book in 1964 titled The Reclusive Herald Square, The Mystery of Ida E. Wood. The book provided the most comprehensive account of her life and the inheritance battle, but the book went out of print quickly and became a footnote in publishing history. Ida Mayfield Wood, born Ellen Walsh, died anonymously and faded into obscurity. Her extraordinary life, the reinvention, the fortune, the isolation, the battle that consumed her final year became a story that fewer people knew with each passing decade. Stand in Herald Square today and try to imagine it. Somewhere above these streets, in a building long demolished, a woman once spent 24 years locked in 2 rooms, guarding $1 million in cash, maintaining a fiction that had defined her entire adult life. She had danced with princes, she had met presidents, she had directed a newspaper fortune, and she ended her life drugged, robbed, and imprisoned by the family that circled her wealth like vultures. The story of Ida Mayfield Wood is not simply about an eccentric recluse or a spectacular inheritance battle. It is about power and the mechanisms that Gilded Age America used to strip women of autonomy. The guardianship that consumed Ida's final year was legal. Declaring her incompetent was legal. Drugging her to search her possessions was legal. Moving her against her will was legal. Charging her estate thousands of dollars per month while she died was legal. Everything done to Ida Wood in her final months was permitted under law. The same law that made it nearly impossible for women to possess their own property, their own money, their own lives. Ida had spent her entire existence fighting against this reality. She had reinvented herself to escape poverty. She had managed her husband's finances to protect herself from his gambling. She had converted all assets to her name to ensure no one could take them. She had withdrawn her fortune from banks to maintain absolute authority. She had locked herself away from a world she did not trust. And in the end, the world broke down her door, declared her insane, took her money, and left her to die surrounded by strangers. The 113 people who fought over her estate saw only dollars. They did not see Ellen Walsh, the immigrant child who had dreamed of something better. They did not see Ida Mayfield, the young woman who had audaciously written a letter that changed her life. They did not see the widow who had brilliantly protected her fortune through decades of economic chaos. The guardianship laws that allowed Ida's family to take command of her life continued largely unchanged for decades. Women across America continued to be declared incompetent, institutionalized, and stripped of their property by male relatives and husbands who stood to inherit. Ida's case did not change these laws. It did not inspire reform. It became a sensational story that entertained newspaper readers during the Depression and then faded into history. But for those willing to look closely, Ida's story reveals truths about Gilded Age America that remain uncomfortable to confront. Behind the grand mansions and glittering balls, behind the wealth and the social climbing, behind the image of Gentile society existed a system that gave women limited choices. Marry well and hope your husband protected you, or find ways to protect yourself that society would inevitably label as madness. Ida chose self-protection. She chose dominion over her circumstances. She chose isolation over vulnerability. And she paid for those choices with her freedom, her dignity, and ultimately her fortune. The threats she feared were real. The people who wanted her money did come. The family members who declared her incompetent did rob her. The guardians did drug her and search her possessions. The world she had locked out did eventually force its way in and take everything. She was right to be afraid. She was just unable to accept that fear had already cost her more than any theft could. The 10 distant Walsh cousins, who ultimately inherited her fortune, never knew.
Ellen Walsh.
They had never heard her story. They received money from a stranger whose existence had been revealed only through lawyers and courts. For them, the inheritance was a windfall during the Depression. For Ida or Ellen or whatever name we choose to call her, the money was everything. It was security. It was power. It was proof that she had succeeded in transforming herself from nothing into something. And in the end, it went to people who had done nothing to earn it, who had no connection to the life she had built, who inherited purely through biological accident. She spent 75 years protecting her wealth from people who might take it. She succeeded brilliantly, keeping the fortune intact through panics, depressions, and death. And then she died. And the law gave her money to strangers. Anyway, the saddest part of her story is not that she died penniless. She did not. It is not that she died alone. She had chosen isolation decades earlier. The saddest part is that she died still fighting for authority she had already lost in a room she did not choose, surrounded by people who saw her only as an obstacle to inheritance. She had been beautiful once. She had been clever, audacious, and successful beyond reasonable hope. She had danced with princes and met presidents. She had built a fortune from nothing and protected it through disasters that destroyed many greater fortunes. And she died screaming from a window that no one heard, that no one answered, that no one even acknowledged. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates the complex, often dark histories behind America's gilded past. The stories we do not tell, the stories of dominion, abuse, and legal robbery disguised as guardianship, are often the stories that matter most. Ida Mayfield deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or a cautionary tale, but as a woman who fought for autonomy in a system designed to deny it, who succeeded brilliantly and failed tragically, and who paid the ultimate price for a lie that should never have been necessary in the first place.